Season 3, Episode 6.
I often say we're living in the days of future history lessons. Everything that we know, the rule book, the sort of global social contract that we kind of signed up to or we were born into is just thrown out the door. How are any solutions that we're designing now going to be fit for purpose?
Hello, I'm Pat Axbom.
And I'm James Royal Lawson.
This is UX Podcast. We're in Stockholm, Sweden, and you're listening to us all over the world from Andorra to Ghana. Aarathi Krishnan is an international aid expert and specializes in humanitarian futures and strategic foresight.
She has over 15 years of global experience in humanitarian and development aid, including a decade with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent.
We talked to Aarathi about accountability, guardrails, bias, choice, who makes the rules, and why creating awareness is essential, but not always enough.
Now, this conversation with Aarathi was recorded during the spring of last year, and it's safe to say a lot has happened in this space since then. So with UX Podcast, we're I suppose, lucky, privileged in that every episode we have listeners, at least according to the data, from people in countries and territories in over 100, well over 100 different places every single episode. And many of them are from developing regions of the world. Not the most, of course. The majority of our listeners come from Western civilizations. It's America, it's Britain, it's Europe. Mm-hmm. But we do have that big chunk. And we try and be mindful of that in many of the conversations we have. But you work within humanitarian sector, do you say? Or
the humanitarian aid system, yeah.
And digitalization there is, well, as big as it is in every other sector, I guess.
Yeah.
But that makes very big daily impacts into that world in maybe ways that a lot of designers don't realise.
Yeah. Tell
me, kind of, what are some of the ways where you see the impact that design has?
I think so. It's siloization is a big part of that. It's humanitarian workers, humanitarian organizations. They're not technologists. They're not technologists. They're not designers, right? They have a different skill set. So, and that in itself is already flawed because it's structured on a colonialist mindset. We come in, we fly in and solve the problem.
Yeah.
So what was happening in the humanitarian and development systems were that because AI and technology was fast changing the world. Let's use technology for more efficiency, etc. Let's bring in or let's partner with different organizations that have that skill set. And so we started to partner with Facebook, Google, name it, IBM, etc., Microsoft, to try and more adequately or more efficiently do the work that we do. And therein that started having problems because you're not translating between worlds. You're not translating between and already the end user is already like three or four times removed from where the solution is being designed. You're trying to solve for a problem in a completely different context. And the people that's going to be on the receiving end or the user of that is actually not part of that design discussion whatsoever. So lots of assumptions are being made by other people about how they lead their lives. So one of the things, in my experience, sitting in Geneva for a long time would be, oh yes, Google will come or any tech company will come and we really want to partner with you. Great. And they're not asking the right questions and we're not asking the right questions of them. So when tech companies themselves, and not naming anyone in particular, are firing their internal ethicists, they are firing their trust and safety teams, etc., and then they come to us and say, hey, we want to partner with you to a humanitarian organization, where we sometimes get a little bit like shiny-eyed at the brand name and then not actually think about, is this an ethical organization? So yeah, we see the biometrics example was just one, I would say. But how we collect and save data, we had, then when blockchain was suddenly the flavor du jour, everybody was on blockchain. And at the end of the day, what all of this does, it reduces everything to a data point. And once you're reduced to a data point, you don't see the needs of people, or not even the needs of people, the desires of people, how they want to be, how they want to show up in the world. And that's not just in the humanitarian system. I often use the example of Aadhaar, who's the digital ID system that was implemented by the Indian government many, many years ago. And it's actually heralded up as one of the best examples of digitalization of identity. Aadhaar, what it did was it collected information about its citizens and also highlighted if you were Muslim, if you're Hindu, what caste you're from, meaning what group you belong in, how high up that caste you're in, if you were gay, if you were trans, or if you belonged to the untouchable community. So this is now available on a government-based wide system that makes it easier for the government to target. And when you've got the Indian government that's publicly and strongly anti-Muslim, easier to target citizens, easier to target people. So even it's not just humanitarian systems, any system that's important in and then implemented in another place. And we're assuming that, yes, let's collect all the data about these people, but we're not assuming or not thinking about how data about that group of people, about your individual identity, can be used against you or your children or your family down the line.
And down the line, that's an incredibly important phrase to do with that, because even if there is a point in time where as a democracy or as a people, you have instilled trust in a government to allow it to collect the data, it's not like you're licensing it. When does it stop? Or what can happen in the future that means that trust was misplaced? Yeah,
because most governments are in for 4 or 5 years. If the prime minister or president lasts that far, you guys, I'm assuming you're from the UK. Yep. Great example.
No, then we have one every kind of 6-7 months.
I think you're. We assume, I think, that things will, and this is the truth of how we lead our lives as human beings, that things will unfold the way it has always unfolded. And we're now living I often say we're living in the days of future history lessons. Everything that we know, the rule book, the sort of global social contract that we kind of signed up to or we were born into is just thrown out the door. International law doesn't seem to apply anymore. So if we're living today where the sets of rules that sort of governed us as humanity are already fast changing, we don't know what that's going to look like in the future. So how are any solutions that we're designing now going to be fit for purpose?
So what you're saying really is even if your intent is the best to make good, you're not safe.
I don't think any of us are safe. No. I think I'm a good person, but it doesn't mean I don't have my own biases and my flaws. I guess what I'm trying to say is the authority in which we make decisions today will have ramifications on a future that doesn't yet exist. Mm-hmm. So how do we make sure that we're using this responsibility in all our day-to-day lives, not just in tech? Like I said, I work in risk, I work in a different space, but how do we make sure that we are being as well informed as possible when we're making those decisions, when we're making the governance of those decisions, right? Because I have to think about, okay, I'm working with these groups of people to design these particular sets of scenarios for risk situations. But if I was just doing it in a very lazy way, I would do it from my comfort of my house, from our tiny apartment. Not consult with anybody, produce a set of work based on the assumptions I have, and then send it out and charge for it. Right?
And that obviously happens more than we would like to imagine.
Absolutely, it does.
But how do we hold people accountable? Because
we don't. We don't. What we don't also have legally is that we don't have downstream, down even from a timeline perspective, reverse accountability. So I might in my organization, with the best of intentions, make a set of decisions today. 5 years from now, for some unfathomable reason, the thing that I designed might be used for harm, even though that wasn't the design purpose. But there's no way that whoever is impacted can come back to me to hold me accountable for that. And I think that's a problem. We need to have a structure in place where we can hold organizations or people to account. Even if their intent of designing it was to be good, they obviously hadn't considered and put enough guardrails or safeguards in to prevent something from being used badly. But, it's an ethics consideration, right? It's like if you're the designer of the car or a truck, and then that truck was then used to drive into a group of people and kill them, who do you hold accountable? But now, as much as I'm not American, so even though I live in the States, but and I'm certainly not holding the U.S. up as any kind of signal of virtue, but that's what the anti-gun movement is really strongly about. So you have you have to use you have to be able to hold the manufacturer or designer of something to account, regardless of how it ends up getting used down the line.
Well, you said about the guardrails there, and that's what you think about, is how do you put guardrails in place to help us make better risk assessments about the design decisions we make now, so they hold going forward into an unknown future. But that's a really hard, difficult problem. I mean, think again about the change of government thing. That you're in a space now where you've looked at a solution and you think, yep, this is safe with the context we are now. How would you fight back against maybe that solution if you see the risk of a change of government being too high? I mean, that's...
So, the first consideration, like you do a design assessment, right? Right. So you're writing certain criteria. This looks safe for this particular context. Add a few more questions. What if this context changes? What if a different government came in? What if you're asking, and sometimes you ask certain questions around, what if our funding gets pulled? What if but ask different questions. It's not impossible. It just takes a little bit longer. And that's what makes it seemingly complex for groups of people that want to get to a solution fast. I guess what I'm saying is let's there's an academic called Audrey Waters, and she said we were taught to move fast and break things, or we were told, was it Google or Facebook?
Yeah,
move fast and break
things.
From
Facebook, yeah.
Yeah, move fast and break things. You know what? That's for dipshits. Like, let's go slowly. We were taught the dipshit argument, move fast and break this. How about we don't break things? How about we build for sustainability, for good? Yeah.
So the complexity, really, what I caught you saying there was that people don't feel like they actually want to talk to other human beings and understand their perspectives.
It's too hard.
Yeah.
So, I thought the speaker after me was really interesting, and he raised a good, well-researched points on that we have to, our brains don't work in that way, and so we want to simplify things. I think that's true, but also I think, actually, no, don't tell me I can't hold multiple things in my brain at the same time. We are capable of complexity. We are capable of holding multiple truths. We just have to make the effort. We just don't make the effort.
And understand that there are multiple truths. And I think what I really want, I hope to get across in this episode as well with you, because you expressed it so well, and this reminding people that human rights is not the same across the world. And I think you have this great example with privacy, because we have defined how privacy should work according to a human rights perspective. But who decided that?
Exactly. So human rights frameworks, they were all designed in Geneva by white men, and it's not wrong. It's not to say it's wrong. They are good principles. But here's a really good example that I can draw on. So as you know, Silicon Valley has all the tech firms in there, right? Google, Facebook, etc. hired, and as you know, that especially in Google and Microsoft, the heads are now all Indian. And so what they did was they brought in a lot of talent from India. Now, there's a thing that happens in India, which is the caste system. And the caste system, depending on where you sit within the caste system, judges you based on your value. Based on your caste, your value is determined, right? What usually happens is those that are in higher caste are often the ones that go get the overseas education because they have access to money, blah, blah, blah. It's similar as a class system, right, in other spaces. But what happened, and this is super interesting, and it's research, it's out there, is that as they were bringing in so much talent from India, what the American HR system, DEI system, didn't consider was that they had policies on that human rights policies. They had don't discriminate based on your class, don't discriminate based on your gender, your sexuality, the color of your skin. They did not touch caste. So suddenly you had entire workforce of people from India that brought in caste discrimination. And it was practiced. People weren't getting jobs. They weren't getting the promotions. Everybody that was in leadership positions that were Indian were of a certain type of caste. And so I can't remember which organization. I want to say it was Google. Might be wrong. But a lot of the workers took their company to court to say, we've been discriminated against based on our caste. Because we were lower caste, we were put in the sort of lower programming jobs, and we can't. And like, it was just replicating this broken system from another context that was imported into San Francisco. And even that, they lost the case, even though there was so much publicity around it, because the court determined that human rights law protected people. But nowhere on human rights law did it protect this group of people that were actively being discriminated on based on their caste. And so they lost. Because they said, well, you are protected against based on human rights, and that's covered in your organization's DEI policy, so you're fine.
So this is where it's more like a definition was missing from another context. That caste
because nobody thought, hey, we wanted to bring in a lot of talent from all over the world. What happens when we bring in, and it doesn't matter, like, the India to the US thing is absolutely fascinating, but you have people from the US go to other places, everywhere. We're humans that move. But we bring in those biases, right? Regardless, I sit with a lot of privilege at the moment, but it doesn't mean I'm not aware of that privilege, but it also doesn't mean I am exempt from my own bias. I think being understanding of that is really important, and I also push back against the idea that it's too complex for us. I think somehow along the line, we sort of decided as human beings that, no, everything has to be a lot simpler, because simple privileges those that are never harmed. Simple privileges those that are not being dehumanized because of their sexuality, dehumanized because of the color of the skin. Simple works if I'm comfortable, I've got a good income, I have air conditioning in my apartment. I don't have to worry about getting a job because of my gender or whatever else.
Yeah, the simple means that you can choose to simplify.
Yeah.
And it's a privilege to have that choice.
I think choice is privilege. I think choice is absolutely privilege. Like I often argue, yes, we must make sure everybody's got a job, but what kind of job? How many jobs must you have to have dignity? You're not just saying, so government policies on make sure everybody's got a job or income, blah, blah, blah. But can we ensure that those jobs have dignity? Amazon, I'm not sure if they're the ones that actually might be, but so many big organizations that have workers literally on the, whatever you call it, the production line, are not allowed to go on breaks, so they are forced to wear diapers. How is that dignified as an adult?
Have you seen any examples of where these things, the harm is found out, and people actually apply the brakes or do something or design something differently to mitigate the risk?
I think there is. One of my favorite examples on this is something I talk about often. It was a group called the Sentinel Project that were based out of Harvard. And in full disclosure, friends of mine have been part of this project. But what their job was to use imagery, satellite imagery, to try and spot human rights harms. And so they were and so it's called the Sentinel, looking out. Right. And it was usually used, so you were using imagery to spot conflict, et cetera, or to resolve conflict when it happened, or something like that. And about a few years in, the founders realized that their imagery was being used for wrong purposes. It was actually being used to spot things that would cause harm to those people. And they realized themselves that they hadn't put guardrails in to protect that. They hadn't put ethics frameworks in, etc. And so they shut down the project because the harm that could be used from releasing that imagery out into the world was too great. And they realized that they hadn't considered a lot of those issues.
Right.
Yeah.
Reminds me of the Google car going around all the cities
Right.
across the world, just filming everything and not having to think of any consequences of that.
Right, and sometimes it's nice, like, you hear stories about people saying so and so passed away, but I can still see them on Google Maps. That's a beautiful story. But what if you don't want to be on Google Maps? Nobody asked our permission to be filmed. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what are your hopes for the future? How should we be acting now to address all these issues?
I mean, I joke that I work in risk, and so I'm very dystopic. I am, but I think understanding the bad is important if we want good to thrive, right? We can't go into this blindly. Let's not assume things unfold the way it's always unfolded. There are so many organizations and people out there doing great things for humanity. And yet sometimes we still bury our head in the sand about all the bad that is also done. So to me, being prepared for the bad, being prepared for risk, being prepared for harm is a way of protecting the good. So what I would say, this is my practice, is no, it's not dystopic. It's actually a form of resistance to the status quo that just says, well, bad shit's going to happen, but it'll happen down the line and I don't have to worry about it now. So this is my form of resistance. I'm like, nope, I want to understand how this is going to unfold. The burden of that harm usually falls on marginalized, minoritized populations. I don't want to stand for that anymore. So let's open our eyes, and I want to understand how this might unfold, and I want to help people be better prepared for that.
So it's really essentially, creating awareness helps because it makes people think.
Yes.
And giving them space to think about those issues as well.
Yeah, but also I think we can have all the awareness in the world and we're not making decisions. So, there's this trope that, we can, we are inclusive. Let's bring all the brown and black people we know around the table and listen to them. But how much of that translates into the decisions that you make as an organization? We're aware that the world is heating up. We're not changing our behavior. So I think awareness is important. But how do we influence different types of decisions, I think, is the more important thing.
So through surfacing issues, we're helping be better prepared, but we're also we're leaving we're creating responsibility too, because then that's going to be documented, I guess, in many situations.
Exactly. Let's be clear about the types of decisions we're making, and if sometimes as an organization you're going to make the decision that's going to privilege you right now because you have to. Your funding, your board, your shareholders, That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But let's be clear about that, and it still doesn't stop us from putting governance measures for the whatever it is that we're dispossessing that is being traded off, because we do trade-offs all the time. But we're like, okay, forget that, whatever, it's out of our line of picture. I guess all I'm trying to say is, if you have to trade off something, be aware that you're trading it off, and still put guardrails in around that.
Yeah, and be transparent about it.
Be transparent about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But a lot of the issue, as we were saying, is we're building bias on top of bias on top of bias. So to solve that piece, we need to tear some stuff down.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, on the panel earlier, Nola talked about our ancestry and created beautiful things. And it was a really interesting moment, because on one side there was a white woman talking about that, on the other side was a white man talking about the practice of measuring the size of primates' brains as a way to measure the tribe's capacity to manage it. And I'm like, and those two things are true, and this is how that practice has been used to actually harm people, and actually your ancestors colonized half the world. So multiple truths are true. Not just being aware of the past is true. Breaking that past down, holding all of us accountable to that, is also part of that responsibility. And she said it really well. Like, we can't just say, oh, well, that didn't happen on my watch. That My colonial past was my colonial past, blah, blah, blah. It was, it was decades ago, centuries ago, and I can't be held accountable. And I'm like, well, actually, yes, we all can. We rest here, not just on the actions of those that came. Well, we rest here on the actions, good and bad, of those that came before us. We have this privilege because our ancestors were either the victim of or made some decisions. And we sit here with that. So,
we can take responsibility for that or not.
Yeah.
But there it is.
But there it is. Let's recognize that this is colonial land, that tribes of indigenous communities were dispossessed. I mean, I'm not here about Sweden. I don't know about the history, but in most parts of the world, yeah. Mm-hmm. But even admitting that is difficult for many governments.
Exactly.
In Australia, which I'm Australian, it was so humiliating. We had a new prime minister, and for once, because we had a history very similar to the UK, where we were going through prime ministers like toilet paper.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, it was just like, oh, you're rubbish, let's get you out. Ironic because, we're part of the Commonwealth. But we finally got a good prime minister in. And one of the things he wanted to do, which was on his election promise, was to recognize Indigenous Australians and to include them as part of, not just into the Constitution, but to have them be represented in Parliament. That was all it was to have Indigenous groups represented in Parliament. And he wasn't going to make the decision unilaterally. It went out to a vote. And everybody, everywhere would go, yeah, of course. Of course. And it didn't win. White Australians predominantly, were so confused about what it meant having a group of people just having representation in Parliament that they thought it would mean that their rights would be taken away. And so in 2022, Australia voted no to have Indigenous Australians represented in Parliament. It defies logic. It defies, and I live now in the United States, and, they overturned abortion law. So rights that are enshrined are also being taken away. So I don't think we can assume anything is unfolding the way it has before. In fact, I would say we're probably Chris that spoke after me put out that show Idiocracy, and I would say he talked about that movie Idiocracy, and I'm like, it's like we're going backwards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we need to be adamant
we need to resist.
Yeah.
Let's just resist. Resistance was formed by many groups that were fighting for their rights and the rights of their community and rights of their people. And it's the idea that we must resist this idea that life must be easy, or life is simple, or life is all of that. It's the beautiful part of that, but it's also not. And so I reject putting my head in the sand. I reject this idea that we must reduce things to its simplest form. Yeah, I think complexity is beautiful. Complex things, complex people are beautiful.
Excellent. Resist, because there's so much talk about inevitability now, about, you can't really stop it. Technology is happening.
Exactly. We're dismissing, we're kind of lifting our hands like this and saying, it'll be all right.
Yeah, somebody will think about it. Yeah. Somebody must be thinking about it. Yes, yeah. Yeah, so, I just say, let's just resist.
Perfect. Thank you.
Of course, my pleasure.
Thank you.
So we did talk towards the end there about awareness not being enough, and I'm glad she brought this up, because it's something I struggle with quite a lot. I know that I'm pretty good at helping create awareness around ethics, for example, in design and in technology. But if I'm not helping people also act on that and take action, does it really make a difference? And how do I get to that point? It's not obvious to me how I do that.
No, and I think, over the years, we do hear an awful lot of pushback from people, who have been made aware. You get like a string of excuses back.
Right, exactly,
in my organisation, or for me, in my job, where I am, there's always kind of like a yes, but.
Exactly. Yes, but I'm still on Facebook because I'm part of this group, or I wouldn't be able to connect with my friends otherwise, as if that's a given. I cannot physically connect with my friends without this piece of technology.
Or yes, but that doesn't happen in my country.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
you create distance to avoid being responsible.
But then there's also the people who completely agree with you, but they still don't act on it. They still don't do anything. So how do we translate all of this into decision making, or that people actually make choices going forward that are for the better for them and for communities, for society?
I mean, we obviously don't want to subject people to harm, or even populations to harm, or societies to harm, just to prove a point so that action happens, which historically is normally what needs to be the case, that we have to push it to the point of breakage and then things tumble down and we tidy it all up. Well, what we discussed in the conversation there was the idea that one step from awareness or creating responsibility and then awareness about things is the need to be prepared for the bad things that can be that could happen, and document them, which I think, I don't know, I mean, it feels kind of, in some ways that feels weak, that, oh God, you know, you've pointed out that you've made me aware of this thing which has really touched me and really moved me, and you're suggesting that I document that it might happen.
Which also could be, it made me think now of sort of role-playing, or knowing, how do I know what to do next time something like this happens? I have to play it out. It's like when you practice CPR. I need to sort of train that muscle. This is how I act in a crisis situation. This is how I act when I notice things going wrong. I need to do this other thing. And that part of that is the documentation.
Yeah, exactly. It's training and documentation. I know that both me and you have been part of training over the years, where you do, you know, crisis management and so on. And yeah, when you do good things that you're proud of, things that your organizations are proud of, it's a good thought exercise and a useful exercise to stress test them of, you know, what if this was the world, or this was the case.
Exactly, yes.
And you're going to have a lot of discussions, and some of it might be that you realize that your thing is so good that it's prepared for these things.
I mean, this is part of what strategic foresight is, that the things that Aarathi works with, in that you sit down and you imagine all these scenarios and you try to figure out, well, if this happens, what route should we take, or what could possibly happen? So these are important exercises. I know when I trained, had my coaching training, we had all of these different scenarios that we played out and talked about how would I act in this situation, even how would I act if my client falls in love with me. We had scenarios where we actually played that out and talked about, well, what is our responsibility in that situation? So if we have talked about it, then it's more likely that we will act.
And you'll be less surprised should it happen.
Exactly, yeah.
Your brain has already been through this once. And if it's documented, then it's like any kind of shared asset that, you know, from corporate values, or, you know, or kind of like team mission statements and all the rest of it. I mean, we know from time and time again that stuff that's written down then, you know, lives a little bit longer than stuff that's just said.
And thinking about this now, I realize I'm often overestimating how quickly I myself have come to an awareness or reached conclusions, and I'm in too much of a hurry for other people to see the same things that I'm seeing. But maybe it took me 10 years, 15 years to arrive here, and I should give them also time to reach that point. I am noticing now that people, given the state of the world, actually, given that people are noticing and remembering. Well, I remember that Pat talked about there were some European alternatives to some tech services. Maybe I should check those out, because they were aware I was talking about it a long time ago. But I was really stressed back then. Why aren't people reacting? Well, I should instead be thankful that they are acting now.
I think it's a really good point, because I mean, I notice sometimes when I'm trying to kind of like bring a point up in maybe a conversation and so on, and and I kind of fluff it. I do it badly in that I think it's the reason that you've just said, that I'm trying to convey and trying to put across maybe several years of thought and thinking and working on something into a kind of like quick 2-sentence answer that you kind of throw into a conversation at a party or whatever because someone's brought up something that triggered it. And the space is too compact and closed to allow it to sink in a healthy way, or even be explained in a good way.
Yeah, there's likely like a name and bias, I guess, around that you're in too much of a hurry, or you yourself think that other people are where you are in thinking, that you're starting too late in your reasoning. You should back up a lot more than you usually do to help more people get on board before you make your point. Yeah.
So you avoid the situation where you're telling people they're wrong, which is sometimes the kind of thing that you end up in when you've reached an understanding about something or an awareness of something. Then depending on the context, that awareness can come across as I know better than you. I have the right answer. You have the wrong one.
Yeah, exactly.
But I was really quite taken by the fact that Aarathi said during the conversation, and this was last year, before several elections and before lots of other things happened, that the global social contract that we grew up with had been thrown out of the door.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big statement.
International laws don't apply anymore, she said as well.
Yeah, I mean, these are big statements, and back then when we talked to her, I don't think it sunk in, or I didn't pick up on it in quite the same way as I did now when we listened back to it.
Yeah, same here.
Because now I think it's more visible to me that the global social contract has been thrown out the door.
Definitely.
Unfortunately. But I think she actually did do an update. It was posted to LinkedIn. But,
you mentioned this to me, right?
Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, it'd be even better if we brought Aarathi back on the show to talk about it. But in place of that, then I think I can read a little bit of her post that reflects on last year and moves the conversation forward from what we discussed. We are no longer in a rules-based world order. We are in a power-based world order. What does this mean? It means we don't have a playbook for how to navigate this, but we need to be prepared to meet this heads-on. Being prepared for the worst is not just a form of resilience. It's also a form of resistance. To ensure we don't become victims of mere observance and rather become active resistors to the status quo. What I know is that our ability to understand in advance the bad that can happen needs work. It needs to be reimagined, continuing to be surprised at the depths of how quickly the bad can evolve is just not good enough anymore.
Powerful stuff, yeah.
Yeah, that's actually, in the context of this conversation you've just heard, then I think that becomes even more powerful.
And it loops back to how she was talking about resistance at the end of the show, and resistance in this context as well. What should people listen to next, James? It was actually reasonably difficult to pull out something which I think would be really good to listen to. But I actually landed on something we did, a conversation we had for our 10th birthday episode, when we talked to Don Norman for the second time. Is this when he talked about education?
Creating a better society.
Okay.
And there was a fair bit about helping, going in there and the savior complex and helping places and so on.
Yeah, helping designers understand more about the responsibility, I think.
Yeah. And I haven't actually listened to that for a fair while. And I know that Don Norman these days can divide opinions. But my memory of that conversation was actually
it was very useful and thought-provoking.
Right.
Episode number 263.
Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side.
James, why can't a nose be 12 inches long?
I don't know, Pa. Why can't a nose be 12 inches long?
Because then it would be a foot.
Oh, that really is terrible.